Some heroes charge into burning buildings, others rush toward gunfire, but in the flooded corridors beneath Chernobyl's shattered Reactor 4, 3 men prepared to descend into water that glowed with invisible death. Aleksei Ananenko, Valeri Bespalov, and Boris Baranov stood at the edge of contaminated darkness on May 4, 1986, wearing improvised diving suits that offered little protection against the radiation saturating every molecule around them. The choice before them was biblical in its severity: enter water so poisoned it would likely kill them within weeks, or allow a steam explosion that could render half of Europe uninhabitable for centuries. No drama, no ceremony, no time for second thoughts. Just 3 Soviet engineers, a broken reactor bleeding radiation into the atmosphere above them, and 20,000 cubic meters of radioactive water waiting below. What they did in that flooded basement would determine whether Chernobyl became history's worst nuclear disaster or an extinction-level catastrophe. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant sat beside the Pripyat River in northern Ukraine, a monument to Soviet technological ambition. 4 RBMK 1000 reactors generated electricity for millions, their cooling towers visible for kilometers across the flat Ukrainian countryside. The facility employed thousands of workers, engineers, and technicians who lived with their families in the purpose-built city of Pripyat, just 3 kilometers away. The reactors were powerful, efficient, and according to Soviet officials, perfectly safe. On the night of the 25th of April 1986, engineers at Reactor 4 prepared to conduct a safety test. The experiment aimed to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough electricity to power emergency systems during a blackout. The test required reducing the reactor to low power, a delicate operation that demanded precise control. But a series of errors, compounded by fundamental design flaws in the RBMK reactor, created conditions for catastrophe. At 1:23 a.m. on the 26th of April, the reactor's power surged uncontrollably. Within seconds, the fuel rods shattered from thermal shock. Superheated steam built to explosive pressure. The massive reactor lid, weighing thousands of tons, lifted like a champagne cork. 2 explosions ripped through the facility in rapid succession. The first was a steam explosion from vaporized coolant. The second, more powerful blast scattered burning graphite and nuclear fuel across the site. Reactor 4's core lay exposed to the night sky, a gaping wound pouring radiation into the atmosphere. Graphite moderator blocks, essential components of the reactor's operation, burned with intense heat, creating a radioactive plume that rose thousands of meters into the air. The explosion killed 2 workers instantly and sent dozens more staggering from the reactor building with radiation burns and acute poisoning. Firefighters from Pripyat arrived within minutes. Unaware they were battling flames fed by nuclear fire, they climbed onto the reactor building's roof, directing water onto burning debris that emitted radiation doses lethal within hours of exposure. Many of these firefighters would die within weeks, their bodies destroyed by radiation that ripped apart cellular structures faster than medicine could repair them. Soviet officials initially struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Early reports claimed a minor incident, perhaps a fire, nothing more. But by dawn, radiation monitoring stations across Europe were detecting alarming increases in atmospheric contamination. The secret could not be contained. The world would soon learn that humanity had lost control of the atom at Chernobyl. What few understood in those first chaotic hours was that the immediate crisis represented only the beginning of the nightmare. As firefighters battled the blaze and radiation poisoned the first responders, scientists and engineers began assessing the full scope of the catastrophe. The news grew progressively worse. Reactor 4's core contained approximately 190 metric tons of nuclear fuel, including highly enriched uranium and plutonium. Much of this material had been pulverized in the explosion and scattered across the site, but a substantial mass remained in the reactor cavity, forming a molten radioactive lava that ate through concrete and steel. This corium, as scientists called the molten fuel mixture, was generating tremendous heat as radioactive decay continued unabated. The mass was burning its way downward through the reactor building's floor, seeking the path of least resistance through compromised concrete and melted metal. Temperature estimates suggested the corium exceeded 2000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt through virtually any barrier given sufficient time. 3 days after the explosion, engineers discovered a problem that made the burning reactor seem manageable by comparison. The reactor building's basement chambers, a labyrinth of corridors and rooms housing pipes, valves, and emergency systems, had flooded with approximately 20,000 cubic meters of water. This water came from broken cooling pipes, firefighting operations, and desperate attempts to cool the reactor by pumping water into the damaged core. Soviet physicist Vasily Nestorenko ran the calculations and felt his blood turn cold. If the descending corium reached the water-filled basement, the result would be a steam explosion of catastrophic proportions. When thousands of tons of molten nuclear fuel at 2000 degrees contacted 20,000 cubic meters of water, the resulting steam expansion would occur with the force of multiple megatons. The explosion would be powerful enough to destroy not just Reactor 4's remains, but the adjacent reactors 1, 2, and 3 as well. The implications were almost incomprehensible. 4 destroyed reactors would release radioactive contamination orders of magnitude greater than the initial explosion. The exclusion zone would expand from tens of kilometers to hundreds. Radiation would render Ukraine's breadbasket farmland uninhabitable. Contamination would spread across Poland, Belarus, and into Central Europe. Conservative estimates suggested the affected area could encompass 500,000 square kilometers, making a region the size of Spain uninhabitable for centuries. Medical projections were equally grim. While the immediate explosion had killed dozens and would claim hundreds more from acute radiation syndrome, a secondary steam explosion could expose millions of people to dangerous radiation levels. Cancer rates would skyrocket across affected populations. Genetic damage would persist for generations. The disaster would fundamentally alter the demographic and economic future of Eastern Europe. Time was running out. The corium continued its inexorable descent, melting through concrete barriers at an estimated rate of 30 centimeters per Dalton Y. Engineers calculated they had perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less, before the molten mass reached the flooded basement. But there was a solution, dangerous and desperate. If someone could reach the critical valves in the basement and open them, the contaminated water would drain into holding tanks. The steam explosion could be prevented. The problem was simple. The valves were submerged in radioactive water, in pitch-black flooded corridors deep beneath the shattered reactor. Aleksei Ananenko was 34 years old in the spring of 1986, a senior engineer who had worked at Chernobyl since its early days. Born in Ukraine, he had studied nuclear engineering at a prestigious technical institute, drawn to the cutting-edge field that promised to power the Soviet future. Ananenko knew the Chernobyl plant intimately. He had helped design modifications to the cooling systems, understood the maze of pipes and corridors beneath each reactor, and could navigate the facility blindfolded. His colleagues described him as methodical and unflappable, the engineer you wanted during a crisis. Ananenko had a wife and young daughter in Pripyat. In the days following the explosion, like most plant workers with families, he had sent them away to stay with relatives while he remained to help manage the disaster. His expertise made him invaluable during the emergency, and he worked with little sleep, coordinating efforts to understand and contain the catastrophe. Valeri Bespalov was younger, in his late 20s, an engineer who specialized in the plant's water circulation systems. He understood valve mechanisms and pipe networks with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from years of hands-on maintenance work. Bespalov was quieter than Ananenko, less given to grand statements, but possessed the same deep competence that characterized Chernobyl's engineering staff. He had grown up in a small Ukrainian town, the first in his family to attend university, and took pride in his role at one of the Soviet Union's premier nuclear facilities. Boris Baranov, the shift supervisor, was the oldest of the three. A veteran of the plant's operations, Baranov understood both the technical systems and the human dynamics of running a nuclear facility. He had seen equipment fail, watched protocols prevent disasters, and knew the importance of experienced judgment when procedures broke down. Baranov's role wasn't technical expertise with valves or pipes, it was leadership and steady presence in impossible situations. When officials explained the flooding problem and the need for someone to dive beneath the reactor to open the drainage valves, they made the risks explicitly clear. The water was heavily contaminated with radiation from the destroyed reactor above. Anyone entering would receive lethal doses. Medical staff estimated survival times in days or weeks, not months or years. This was not a rescue mission where heroes might survive. This was a request for volunteers to undertake a suicide mission to prevent a continental catastrophe. No one was forced. The Soviet system, for all its authoritarianism, did not compel men to swim through radioactive water. Officials asked for volunteers and waited. Ananenko stepped forward first. He knew the valve locations, understood the piping systems, and recognized that his expertise gave the mission its best chance of success. Bespalov volunteered next, his knowledge of valve mechanisms complementing Ananenko's system expertise. Baranov completed the trio, insisting that someone needed to guide them with a lamp through the pitch-black corridors. Their motivations were complex and deeply personal. Ananenko later spoke of thinking about his daughter and the Europe she would inherit. Bespalov mentioned the thousands of plant workers still on site, continuing to operate the 3 intact reactors. Baranov, characteristically, focused on the practical. Someone had to do it, and they were the most qualified. No speeches, no dramatic pronouncements. Just 3 Soviet engineers concluding that their knowledge and their willingness were the only things standing between Chernobyl and apocalypse. The logistics of preparing for an underwater mission in an active disaster zone required desperate improvisation. Chernobyl had no diving equipment designed for radioactive environments. Officials scrambled to locate diving suits, finally securing heavy rubber protective gear from Soviet military stockpiles. The suits were designed for chemical contamination, not radiation, but they would provide some barrier against direct contact with contaminated water. Engineers studied crude maps of the basement layout, trying to plot a route through flooded corridors that might have been damaged by the explosion. The valves they needed to reach were located in 2 separate chambers, requiring the team to navigate multiple passages in complete darkness. Structural integrity was unknown. Debris could block passages. Radiation levels in the water were estimated but not confirmed. Existing measurement equipment had been destroyed or contaminated beyond use. Medical staff calculated radiation exposure projections with grim precision. The water contained radioactive isotopes including cesium, strontium, and iodine, along with contaminated debris from the reactor core. Every minute in the water meant absorbing radiation that would damage bone marrow, destroy the gastrointestinal system, and eventually break down cellular structures throughout the body. The doctors provided the men with potassium iodide tablets to protect their thyroid glands, knowing this measure was woefully inadequate against the radiation they would encounter. Officials held a somber meeting with the 3 volunteers. The language was direct, stripped of Soviet optimism or propaganda. They would likely die from radiation exposure. The timeline could be days, weeks, or at best months. Medical treatment would ease their suffering but could not save them. Their families would be cared for. They would receive Soviet honors, and their sacrifice would be remembered. The men listened quietly, nodded, and asked technical questions about valve mechanisms and water depth. The farewell moments carried the weight of finality. Colleagues who had worked alongside Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov for years struggled to find words. Some offered encouragement that rang hollow against the reality of what the 3 men faced. Others simply shook their hands in silence, conveying respect that needed no elaboration. The men wrote letters to their families, brief notes that said goodbye without dwelling on the horror of their situation. As they prepared to descend, the 3 engineers helped each other into the heavy diving suits. The gear was cumbersome, the rubber thick and inflexible. Baranov carried a lamp, its beam seeming pathetically inadequate for the darkness they would enter. Ananenko carried a crude map, though he knew he would navigate primarily from memory and feel. Bespalov brought tools for opening the valves, uncertain what condition they would find the mechanisms in after days of submersion. They stood at the entrance to the flooded basement, the contaminated water lapping at concrete steps that descended into blackness. Radiation detectors nearby clicked frantically, their needles pushed far beyond safe ranges. The reactor burned above them, releasing radiation into the spring air. Europe waited unknowingly for the outcome of their mission. 3 men dressed in makeshift diving gear, prepared to enter water that promised death to prevent an explosion that promised apocalypse. The water was colder than they expected. Ananenko entered first, feeling the weight of contaminated liquid press against his diving suit as he descended the concrete steps into darkness. Baranov followed, holding the lamp above the waterline as long as possible before submersion. Bespalov came last, tools secured to his belt, mentally reviewing the valve opening procedures he would need to execute blind in radioactive water. The lamp beam cut through murky blackness, revealing swirling sediment and debris suspended in the flood. Visibility extended barely 2 meters. Ananenko oriented himself using memory, identifying structural elements he had walked past dozens of times when these corridors were dry and lit by fluorescent lights. The explosion had transformed familiar passages into an alien environment, but the fundamental architecture remained. They moved slowly, fighting the resistance of heavy suits and contaminated water. The dosimeters they carried clicked constantly, measuring radiation that accumulated with every passing second. Ananenko led them through the first corridor, one hand trailing along the concrete wall for orientation. Debris bumped against their suits, bits of insulation, broken pipes, chunks of concrete dislodged by the explosion. The first valve location was approximately 50 meters from their entry point, a journey that felt endless in the claustrophobic darkness. Ananenko felt his breathing accelerate inside the suit, forced himself to slow and control his respiration. Panic was as dangerous as radiation here. Baranov kept the lamp steady, providing the only reference point in a world reduced to black water and uncertain direction. They found the first valve chamber more by luck than navigation. Ananenko's outstretched hand contacted a pipe he recognized, a junction that marked their destination. He signaled to Bespalov, who moved forward to assess the valve mechanism. The wheel that would open the valve was exactly where the blueprints indicated, submerged but accessible. Bespalov gripped the wheel and pulled. Nothing. Corrosion or debris had jammed the mechanism. He adjusted his position, braced against the wall, and applied more force. The wheel resisted, then suddenly broke free, turning in his hands with mechanical reluctance. Water began flowing through newly opened passages, draining toward collection tanks deeper in the facility. One valve open, one more to go. The second valve location required navigating a more complex route through connecting corridors. Ananenko led them deeper into the basement maze, the lamp beam revealing passage after passage, filled with contaminated water. They encountered blocked sections, where debris forced them to find alternate routes. Time stretched in the darkness, minutes feeling like hours as they searched for landmarks in the murk. Ananenko began to doubt his navigation when his hand suddenly contacted the distinctive shape of a pressure gauge. He knew marked the second valve chamber. Relief flooded through him. They had found it. Bespalov moved past him to the valve wheel, this time working with practiced efficiency. The mechanism turned more easily than the first. Water began draining from this section as well. The return journey was faster, fear and exhaustion lending speed to their movements. They retraced their path through dark corridors, following Baranov's lamp back toward the entry point. The contaminated water seemed heavier now, pressing against their suits with malevolent weight. They emerged finally onto the concrete steps, climbing back into the radioactive air that felt paradoxically clean compared to the darkness below. The 3 men stood dripping in the staging area, contaminated water pooling around their boots. Engineers monitoring the drainage system confirmed success. The valves were open, water levels in the basement chambers were dropping. The threat of a steam explosion had been eliminated. Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov had accomplished what had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Medical personnel immediately began decontamination procedures. The diving suits were carefully removed and secured for disposal. Every surface they had contacted was now radioactive waste. The men themselves underwent thorough washing, scrubbing away contamination that had penetrated through suit seams. Dosimeter readings provided the grim accounting. Each man had absorbed significant radiation during their time in the water. But the doses were not immediately lethal. Initial assessments suggested they had received between 5 and 10 sieverts, dangerous levels that would cause radiation sickness but were below the threshold for acute radiation syndrome. Medical staff began treatment protocols, blood transfusions to support compromised bone marrow, medications to ease nausea and pain. The doctors spoke carefully, avoiding predictions about long-term survival while providing the best supportive care available. Soviet officials documented the mission as a success, recognizing that the 3 engineers had prevented a catastrophe that would have dwarfed the initial explosion. But there was little time for celebration. Chernobyl remained an active disaster requiring thousands of workers to prevent further contamination. The successful drainage of the basement chambers enabled the next phases of the response. The evacuation of Pripyat had begun days earlier. 30,000 residents relocated away from the radiation zone. Now the exclusion zone expanded as contamination patterns became clearer. Villages were emptied, livestock destroyed, topsoil removed from fields. The Soviet state mobilized an army of liquidators, workers drafted to help contain the disaster through sheer manpower and grim determination. Engineers began planning the sarcophagus, a massive concrete structure that would eventually encase Reactor 4's remains. Construction would require working in lethal radiation fields, exposing thousands of workers to doses that would impact their health for decades. The 3 divers' mission had made this possible by preventing the steam explosion that would have destroyed the worksite and scattered even more radioactive material across the region. Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov remained at Chernobyl for several more weeks, contributing their expertise to ongoing containment efforts. They experienced symptoms of radiation exposure, nausea, fatigue, weakened immune systems. But they continued working. Their survival contradicted early predictions of rapid death. Medical monitoring became a long-term proposition rather than a death watch. International attention focused on Chernobyl as the full scale of the disaster emerged. The Soviet Union initially tried to minimize the incident, but eventually acknowledged its severity. The 3 divers' mission became part of the larger narrative of heroism and sacrifice that characterized the response. Thousands of workers, from helicopter pilots dropping sand and boron onto the exposed reactor core to soldiers cleaning radioactive debris from rooftops, contributed to preventing an even worse catastrophe. The drainage mission's success became a turning point. It enabled the construction work, the decontamination efforts, and the eventual stabilization of the site that would allow the 3 remaining reactors to continue operating. The men who had descended into radioactive darkness had given the Soviet Union a chance to contain its catastrophic failure. Within months of the dive, a story began spreading across Europe and eventually worldwide. 3 heroic Soviet engineers had volunteered for a suicide mission, descending into radioactive water beneath Chernobyl's destroyed reactor to prevent a continental catastrophe. All 3 men died within weeks of their mission, martyrs who sacrificed themselves to save millions. The tale was told in newspapers, books, and eventually documentaries. It became one of the defining narratives of Chernobyl, a story of ultimate sacrifice in the face of technological disaster. The story resonated because it captured something essential about human courage. 3 ordinary engineers, faced with an impossible choice, descended into certain death to prevent unimaginable destruction. Their willingness to die for others embodied the highest form of heroism. The narrative was clean, dramatic, and emotionally powerful. It spread rapidly, repeated in media accounts and historical summaries of the Chernobyl disaster. But the story was wrong. Aleksei Ananenko did not die within weeks of the dive. He continued working in the nuclear industry, contributing his expertise to safety improvements and reactor design modifications. He lived for decades after his descent into the flooded basement, eventually passing away in 2019 at the age of 65. Valeri Bespalov similarly survived, living until 2015 when he died at age 65. Boris Baranov died in 2005 at 65. The radiation doses they received during the dive, while significant, were not immediately lethal. Medical treatment and monitoring helped manage the health impacts. All three men experienced radiation-related health problems throughout their lives, weakened immune systems, increased cancer risk, chronic fatigue, but they did not die quickly, and their extended survival complicated the simple narrative of martyrdom. How did the myth of immediate death become more famous than the reality of survival? Partly through miscommunication and incomplete information. Early predictions about their survival were genuinely grim. Medical staff expected rapid deterioration based on estimated radiation doses. When these predictions did not materialize, the corrections never achieved the same cultural traction as the original story. The myth also served narrative purposes. A tale of instant sacrifice was more dramatically satisfying than the messy reality of chronic radiation exposure and long-term health monitoring. The story of three men who accepted certain death was cleaner than three men who faced probable death, but survived with health complications. Heroism, in popular imagination, often requires martyrdom to feel complete. Western media covering Chernobyl in the 1980s had limited access to information about individual Soviet workers. The story of the divers reached Western audiences through fragmentary reports that emphasized sacrifice over survival. By the time more accurate information became available, the myth had already embedded itself in collective memory. Corrections rarely displace compelling narratives once established. The truth of their survival does not diminish their courage. Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov descended into radioactive water, knowing they would likely die. Their willingness to accept that probable death to prevent catastrophe remains heroic, regardless of the actual outcome. That they survived makes their story more complex, not less meaningful. The successful drainage of Chernobyl's basement chambers created the foundation for everything that followed in the containment effort. Without the divers' mission, the steam explosion would have destroyed any possibility of stabilizing the site. The corium would have continued its descent unimpeded. The resulting blast would have scattered radioactive material across a vast area, and the three remaining reactors would have been compromised beyond any hope of control. Instead, engineers were able to proceed with constructing the sarcophagus around Reactor 4's remains. Construction began in June 1986 and required extraordinary measures to protect workers from radiation. Robots and remote equipment handled the most dangerous tasks, but human workers still faced exposures that shortened lifespans and caused lasting health problems. Over 600,000 workers participated in various aspects of the cleanup and containment. These liquidators formed an army conscripted to fight an invisible enemy. The sarcophagus, completed in November 1986, was a massive concrete and steel structure designed to contain the radioactive remains for decades. Its construction was only possible because the basement chambers had been drained, providing stable ground conditions and eliminating the steam explosion threat. Engineers could work knowing that molten corium would not trigger a secondary disaster that would destroy their efforts. The three remaining reactors at Chernobyl continued operating for years after the disaster, providing electricity to Ukraine while the damaged Reactor 4 sat entombed nearby. This controversial decision was enabled by the successful containment of Reactor 4, without which the entire facility would have been lost. Reactor 2 operated until 1991, Reactor 1 until 1996, and Reactor 3 until 2000. When the plant was finally shut down completely, international nuclear safety protocols were fundamentally revised following Chernobyl. The disaster exposed critical flaws in RBMK reactor design, including positive void coefficient problems that made the reactors unstable at low power. Countries worldwide reviewed their nuclear facilities, implementing new safety measures and monitoring systems. The International Atomic Energy Agency expanded its role in global nuclear oversight. Research into radiation exposure and health impacts accelerated dramatically. Medical professionals studied the liquidators and exposed populations to understand long-term effects of radiation contamination. This research improved treatment protocols for radiation exposure and advanced knowledge about cellular damage from ionizing radiation. The grim human cost of Chernobyl generated medical knowledge that improved care for future radiation accidents. The disaster influenced public opinion about nuclear power worldwide. Anti-nuclear movements gained strength as Chernobyl demonstrated catastrophic failure scenarios that governments had downplayed. Some countries accelerated plans to phase out nuclear power, while others implemented stricter safety regulations. The debate over nuclear energy's role in meeting electricity demands became more complex and urgent. Environmental science advanced through studying Chernobyl's contamination. Researchers tracked radioactive isotopes through ecosystems, studying how contamination moved through soil, water, plants, and animals. The exclusion zone became an unintended laboratory for understanding radiation's long-term ecological effects. Wildlife populations in the abandoned region provided data on species adaptation to radioactive environments. The new Safe Confinement, completed in 2016, replaced the deteriorating original sarcophagus with a massive steel structure designed to contain the radioactive remains for another century. This 30,000-ton arch, one of the largest movable structures ever built, represents ongoing efforts to manage Chernobyl's legacy. The three divers' mission in 1986 made all subsequent containment work possible by preventing the explosion that would have destroyed the site. Aleksei Ananenko lived 33 years after descending into radioactive water. Valeri Bespalov had 29 years. Boris Baranov received 19. None died the quick deaths predicted for them in May 1986. Their survival was complicated, marked by health problems and medical monitoring, but it was survival nonetheless. They remained connected to Chernobyl throughout their lives, continuing to work in nuclear safety and operations. Recognition came gradually. Soviet honors acknowledged their contribution, but secrecy limited public awareness for years. As information became accessible, their story reached wider audiences. They gave occasional interviews, always emphasizing collective effort over individual heroism. Their legacy transcends the specific act of draining flooded chambers. Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov demonstrated courage that required descending into darkness without knowing if they would survive. Their willingness to face probable death prevented catastrophe that would have reshaped European history. Some heroes charge into fire seeking glory. Others descend into darkness because they are the only ones who can. The three men who went under the reactor chose duty over survival and the lives of millions over their own probable deaths. They emerged from radioactive water into decades of life, carrying the quiet understanding that heroism is not about dying well, but about choosing to risk death for others and living to remember why the risk mattered.